Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's finish up our look at the economic status of the AP6 with China, Nigeria, and Mexico. Remember, we're dealing with periods of uh, more liberalization through the concept of privatization, making government owned property private or business owned, and periods of nationalization, which is making privately owned property or businesses owned by the government, which is less economic liberalization. Let's start with China. China has really early dynastic and nationalist periods, and those are mainly nationalized or not really any serious economic systems that exist. They're run by essentially dictators, emperors, and then the nationalist dictators of China up until 1949. Then comes in Mao Zedong and the Chinese Communist Party in 1949. It becomes a purely socialist state. The government decides everything through the use of 5 year plans. Every 5 years, they get together and say, what are we going to do? Primarily, they focus around agriculture and steel production, and most of their population engages in that due to straight oppression and really failed economic policies. Somewhere around 30 million to 40 million people end up dying under Mao Zedong. It's just really a failed economic system. Then we have Deng Xiaoping, one of the most important names in Chinese history and a must. Deng Xiaoping comes about in 1978 and begins Chinese economic liberalization. He starts it by creating what are known as special economic zones along the coast of China. Probably the most well known one that you may know is Shenzhen. It's the location of where like Apple does a lot of its products now. But special economic zones are an area that has different economic regulations to attract that foreign investment, the foreign direct investment. And so it's East China. This is where these special economic zones start, and then more foreign money floods into them, and you start to see economic growth really prosper in these areas of zones. So you'll have like less taxation, less regulation, greater ability to trade within these specific cities, and then it starts to spread out over the period of time. He also starts to go to small scale farmers and says, you don't have to be collectivized anymore. You can start selling your own crops, owning small plots of land, making yourselves kind of a little more entrepreneurial. And over time, the private sector starts to build in China. And when you get into the late 80s and early 90s, especially the early 90s, to attract away from the Tiananmen Square massacre, you start to have gradual buildup of liberalization. Not the same shock therapy as you see in the Soviet Union. You have slow release of privatized businesses over time. And the impact of this um, allows for the society to not just fall apart. The Chinese Communist Party does a great job building a more privatized economic system. To when you get to the pinnacle of Chinese growth, the CCP has basically stopped overseeing private industries and private businesses. You have a lot of technocrats from the United States and Europe that go and run businesses in China. Import taxes are strongly reduced. They join the World Trade Organizations to work out trade disputes within the Interstate Trade Organization. And one of the most famous quotes that Deng Xiaoping gives is, to get rich is glorious for the Chinese Communist Party, which is kind of against the idea of Marxism and communism. But he literally says, to be a good party member is to actually be rich, that's a part of making a well run society. And so what happens is GDP of China, of course, goes up, and the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party rises with it. Because not only GDP goes up, but GDP per capita goes from around $700 a year to what is now over 12,000. So a lot of the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party is tied to how well that country grows economically. Now Xi Jinping has come to power since 2008. He has reversed a lot of the trends. Businesses now have directors, or board of directors now have oversight by the Chinese Communist Party. Especially big businesses may actually have party members on the boards. He's banned, privatization of education, crypto mining, publicly releasing stock of a company, and he's really focused on, okay, Chinese products for Chinese people, really turning internal for his production. Where has this left China? Well, now we have some greater sense of nationalization happening. It's a market socialist state. Basic industries are pretty much public owned by the government. Still, some private businesses, especially when you're going to the lower level private business. But when it comes to if you're a business of any size, you're going to have Chinese Communist Party influence. State-owned businesses are very big here, and then it is primed for an economic downturn due to massive debt loads that it has had, and economic growth is starting to turn. Nigeria. Nigeria has a pretty simple story. It is a colonial power until 1960. When it breaks away and becomes independent, it immediately becomes a rentier state based on its oil production. There's no real economic system, and there is at least a good decade of ethnic civil war and that kills eventually millions of people. And when you get to 1971, you start to have a collection of dictators up until 1999, a lot of violence, a lot of coups as governments are overthrown. But something else happened in the 1980s, and that is a greater sense of trade and the nationalization of the oil industry by the government, specifically done by something known as a parastatal. A parastatal is basically a corporation that's owned privately in theory, but its board members are either ministers of the government or are actually appointed by government ministers. And this is often done through corruption, patron clientelism, the idea that I will offer you a position in power or favors, and you help support me in my quest to try to maintain government power. And so this allows for the business to have to essentially be connected to the government and the government influence what the business does. So you see this in Nigeria with the Nigeria National Petroleum Corporation, and you see it in Mexico with the current parastatal known as Pemex. Both are important, super important to the economic growth of the country. Nigeria becomes a democracy in 1999 with the new constitution. Oil is fully nationalized by this time. Most industries in uh, Nigeria are privately owned, but the government structure is so weak. It's insanely corrupt. It's very hard to do things like simply collect taxes is insanely difficult. So there's a lot of underground markets that exist within the country. The system is pretty unstable. So we have no economic system up until 1970. Then we have the nationalization of the oil industry going forward. It is the most corrupt country in the AP6. It's more of like a very weak laissez-faire neoliberal state. There's lots of private businesses, but very little government oversight, and that government oversight is often extremely corrupt. The last country we're going to look at is Mexico, which is a little complicated. Mexico from 1876 to 1910 is run by Porfirio Diaz. He is a dictator, lots of support from the United States, and lots of privatization from foreign countries, foreign investment that goes and pours into Mexico, building infrastructure. Eventually, the Porfiriato, by the way, is just the time that Porfirio Diaz runs Mexico. Over the next 10 years after 1910, you have the Mexican Revolution. It's a time of chaos. No economic system is really set and implemented until 1917, when the PRI, which is a political party, starts to jump in and starts to manifest itself. And the Mexican miracle begins with that president, Lázaro Cárdenas. He nationalizes the oil and rail industries, really kicks out a lot of foreign investment, creates the parastatal known as Pemex. It becomes a more rentier state with oil. He also really does a lot for the southern indigenous, as former Aztec and Mayan tribes. A lot of communal land grants. So I want to give you this piece of property. It's kind of public property owned by the community, known as ejidos, and that becomes very popular. And he becomes like a person, a populist to the people. Supports massive infrastructure projects and supports the idea of import substitution. Mexico grows. It's very corrupt. The PRI is a one party authoritarian state, and it grows only to a certain point before the economy stagnates. Then, from the 1970s, the president, much more privatized country. You have NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which allows for free trade between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. Um, Mexico develops special economic zones along the northern border with the United States, maquiladoras, which are basically American companies that come across. They get special taxation, environmental regulations are reduced, and they almost exclusively make their goods for the citizens of the United States. Mexico becomes the number one, or the U.S. becomes the number one trading partner with Mexico. 79% of all trade is with the United States. We are essentially, economically and a lot of socially, very interconnected. So, what is the economic status of Mexico? We have privatization, then we have nationalization, and now since 1970, we're more privatized. Obviously, corruption and the drug trade is very, very, very problematic in Mexico. It is considered a neoliberal state. Lots of private businesses. They have safety nets. They are quite limited. And remember that probably around a quarter of the country is not actually run by the government, that the drug cartels have an enormous amount of influence there. So that is the economic status of your AP6.